The rain had a way of hiding the sins of this city. It beat down in sheets, washing the streets clean, but no amount of rain could wash away the blood. New York, 1977. A city at war with itself. Lights flickered, shadows grew long, and somewhere out there, a man hunted in the dark. They called him the Son of Sam. It was a name the newspapers loved, a boogeyman for the front page. He struck without warning. Random, cold, calculated. 6 dead. 7 more clinging to life. People were afraid to leave their homes. The night was no longer safe, and every time he killed, he left behind a piece of himself. A taunt, a clue, a sick game of cat and mouse. I didn't believe in monsters, but after those killings, I had to wonder if maybe I was wrong. The task force called me in when the letters started arriving, handwritten, dripping with madness. "I am the Son of Sam," he said. "I live for the hunt." He was close, always one step ahead, and every day the city slid deeper into fear. But that's what this job is, stepping into the darkness, waiting for the moment when it finally steps back. And I was getting ready to meet it head on. Act 1. The Killer Strikes Again. The summer of '76 was brutal. The heat clung to the city like a second skin, turning the streets into a pressure cooker of tempers and fear. By the time the first shots rang out, New Yorkers were already on edge, but no one could have known what was coming. At first, it was just one murder, a random act of violence that blended into the background noise of a city that had seen too much. But then it happened again, and again. I remember the first body, Donna Loria, a Bronx girl just 18, shot while sitting in her car with a friend, Jody Valenti. It was late, just past 1 a.m. Loria never saw it coming. 1 bullet to the head. Jody survived, but her memory of the shooter was hazy. A stocky guy with curly hair, not much to go on. Back then, we didn't know we were dealing with a serial killer. No one did. The city was still holding its breath, waiting for the next move. But the next move came, and it came with a vengeance. By July of '77, the name Son of Sam had become the kind of headline that sold newspapers by the truckload. 6 dead, 7 wounded. Lovers shot in their cars, just kids really, gunned down while they sat in the dark. The bullets were always the same, .44 caliber. The signature of a killer who didn't care about his victims, didn't care about their lives. He wasn't in it for the thrill of the kill. This guy wanted to send a message. I was called in on the Loria case back when it was just another unsolved homicide in a city drowning in crime. But as the bodies piled up, the task force knew we were in over our heads. The letters started showing up, taunting us, mocking us. "I am the Son of Sam," they said. "I live for the hunt." The press ate it up, turned the guy into a legend overnight. But legends are just stories. I was after the man behind the legend. By the time we got to the scene that summer night in Queens, we knew who we were chasing, or at least we thought we did. The rain had started up again, drumming a steady beat on the roof of the car as I stepped out. The red and blue lights casting long shadows on the wet pavement. Another couple, shot dead in their car. Robert Violante and Stacy Moskowitz, the last of the son of Sam's victims. But nobody knew it then. I stood there, watching as the techs went to work. The scene was familiar by now, too familiar. The same precision, the same lack of remorse. 1 bullet to the head, another to the body. He didn't leave anything behind but fear and confusion. The kind of confusion that eats away at a city from the inside out. Stacy was gone before the medics even arrived. Robert clung to life, but barely. His injuries were too severe, and even if he survived, he'd never see the world the same way again. I could feel it. The killer was getting reckless. He wasn't just shooting in the dark anymore. He was shooting to be seen. Every crime scene, every body. It was all building towards something big. And this one felt different. It wasn't just another killing, it was a message. We had been chasing him for over a year, and all we had to show for it were dead bodies and frantic guesses. Every lead we followed turned cold. Every piece of evidence seemed to slip through our fingers. But something about tonight, the way the killer chose his targets, the way he left them, told me one thing. He wanted us to know. He wanted us to feel his presence, to know that no matter how hard we tried, he would always be one step ahead. Or at least, that's what he wanted us to believe. But there was one thing we hadn't counted on: a break in the case. A clue so small it almost slipped past unnoticed. A woman walking her dog, a black Labrador named Harvey, had seen something strange. Her neighbor's car had a parking ticket near the scene of the Moskowitz killing. Her neighbor, David Berkowitz. And just like that, the name we'd been searching for fell right into our laps. Berkowitz. The name felt heavy in my mouth, like a bad taste you couldn't spit out. The kid lived in Yonkers, just a few miles from the murder scenes. Quiet, kept to himself. But when you looked a little deeper, you found a man unraveling at the seams. Letters, erratic behavior, a mind slipping into darkness. It wasn't over yet, not by a long shot. But for the first time in a year, we had a lead. And in a city where shadows hid more than secrets, a lead was all I needed. Act 2. The Letters from a Madman. David Berkowitz. The name still didn't sit right with me. Sure, we had the tip from his neighbor about that parking ticket. The timing lined up, but I'd seen too many cases fall apart over shaky leads and coincidence. A name was one thing, but I needed more. I needed proof that the man behind that door was the son of Sam, the monster we'd been chasing for over a year. And the letters. They'd been mocking us from the start. It was back in April 1977 when the first letter landed on our desk. Handwritten, scrawled with a shaky, almost childlike hand. It read like a riddle, a taunt. I am a monster. I am the son of Sam. He talked about demons, about commands he couldn't ignore. Sam was his master, he said. But it was all theater, the ramblings of a madman. Or so we thought. I read that letter more times than I care to admit, searching for something, anything, that would give me a glimpse into the killer's mind. He wasn't just a lunatic shooting random couples in cars. There was method to his madness. And that's what scared me. The calculated way he'd pick his targets, send his letters. He knew exactly what he was doing, how to keep the city on edge. The media loved him for it. Front page after front page, feeding into the terror. We'd set up a task force, dozens of detectives sifting through thousands of leads. Everyone had a theory. A jilted lover, a deranged Vietnam vet, maybe even a cop gone rogue. The theories were endless, but none of them stuck. And then, there was the dog. The letters mentioned it. Harvey, the black Labrador. He's the one that talks to me, the killer wrote. Sam's voice comes through him. He commands me to kill. Crazy, right? That's what I thought too. But then there was the neighbor, Wheatcar, who lived near Berkowitz. She mentioned her dog had been shot. A black Labrador. And not just any dog, Harvey. The same name, the same dog. That's when it hit me. Berkowitz wasn't just some name on a parking ticket. He was our guy. Still, it wasn't enough to move in on him just yet. We needed something concrete. Yonkers PD had their suspicions about Berkowitz for a while, even before the Moskowitz shooting. Weird stuff happening around his apartment. Strange letters, fires being set. They said he fit the profile. A loner. A man who kept to himself, but had a darkness lurking beneath the surface. And now, with the Carr family's statement and that parking ticket, we were finally closing in. It was August 9th when we made the decision. We'd been chasing shadows for too long, and it was time to bring this nightmare to an end. I remember standing in front of that dingy apartment complex on Pine Street, watching the rain soak the pavement. Berkowitz's car sat parked outside, just as the tip had said. We were ready to search it, but we had to wait for a warrant. No point in risking the case on a technicality. We approached the car carefully, flashlights cutting through the darkness, and there, plain as day, was a gun sitting on the back seat. Not exactly subtle. When we opened the door, it was like the floodgates opened. Ammunition, maps of the crime scenes, and then the icing on the cake, a letter, addressed to the head of the Son of Sam task force, Timothy Dowd. This was it, the proof we needed. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was too easy. Berkowitz was smart, careful, leaving a gun in plain sight, handwriting letters that would be found so easily. It felt wrong. But then again, killers like him often have a moment where they get careless, where the arrogance creeps in and they think they're invincible. Maybe that's what this was, or maybe he wanted to get caught. I wasn't sure which theory I believed more, but there was no time for second guessing. We had to move fast before Berkowitz vanished into the night. We waited until he left the building. Didn't want a firefight in those narrow hallways. Around 10 p.m., he stepped out, looking calm as ever. He didn't run, didn't flinch, just walked straight to his car like it was any other night. That's when I knew something was off. Berkowitz wasn't surprised to see us. Hell, he looked almost relieved. I approached him slowly, gun in hand. He didn't resist, just turned to me and said, "Well, you got me." Like it was the punchline to some sick joke. And just like that, it was over. Or so we thought. I stood there, watching as they cuffed him, rain dripping off my hat brim. Part of me expected a fight, a final struggle. But Berkowitz gave us nothing. No resistance, no remorse. Just a vacant stare, as if he'd been waiting for this moment all along. The man who had held a city hostage for over a year was now just another guy in handcuffs. But deep down, I knew this case wasn't as cut and dry as it seemed. The letters, the dog, the madness in his eyes, it all pointed to something darker, something we hadn't uncovered yet. Berkowitz was the killer, no doubt about it. But the story wasn't finished. Act 3. The night it ended. The precinct was buzzing when we brought Berkowitz in. Detectives, reporters, hell, even cops who had no business being there, all crowding around like vultures waiting for the final scraps. They wanted their story, their front page headline, "Son of Sam Caught." But I wasn't interested in headlines. I was interested in answers. We finally had him, but something about the whole thing gnawed at me, deep in my gut. Berkowitz sat in the interrogation room, hands cuffed, eyes glazed over like he wasn't really there. The man had terrorized New York for over a year, and now he just sat there, calm, almost detached from reality. No anger, no fear. It was like he'd already made peace with what was coming. I walked into the room, cigarette hanging from my lips, and sat across from him. The smoke drifted between us, but Berkowitz didn't blink. He just stared, as if he was seeing something far away. The room was silent, except for the distant hum of the city outside, rain still tapping against the windows. I leaned forward, hands folded on the table. "You don't look surprised to be here," I said, my voice steady, calm. Berkowitz smirked, just a twitch at the corner of his mouth. "I knew you'd come for me eventually," he replied, his voice low, almost a whisper. It was only a matter of time. I studied him for a moment. He wasn't what I expected. Most killers, when they get caught, they're either defiant or terrified. But Berkowitz, he was something else. He looked at me like he was in on a joke that no one else understood. The letters, the taunts, the elaborate game he'd played, it all led to this moment. And here he was, calm as a man about to check out of a hotel. "You're the son of Sam," I said, more as a statement than a question. He nodded slowly. "That's what they call me." "And the letters?" I asked, leaning back in my chair. "The demons? The voices? Is that what this was all about?" For a moment, something flickered behind his eyes. Something dark, something unhinged. "Sam," he said quietly. "He speaks to me, through the dog, through the night. He commands me." I'd read those letters 100 times, each word dripping with madness. But hearing it in person, hearing it from his lips, it was different. The room seemed to shrink, the air thick with something I couldn't quite place. I let the silence sit for a moment, watching him. He didn't flinch, didn't look away. It was like he believed every word he was saying. "What about the others?" I pressed. "The ones who helped you?" Berkowitz tilted his head slightly, almost like he was amused by the question. "Others?" he said, a smile creeping across his face. "There are no others, just me. Always been just me." I wanted to believe him, but something about it didn't sit right. We'd heard rumors, whispers about a group, something bigger than just one man, and the letters hinted at it too. He wrote about a group, about rituals, about things that went deeper than just random killings. But Berkowitz? He was sticking to his story. The lone wolf, the madman who heard voices. It was a story that fit, but it wasn't enough. Not for me. "Tell me about the killings," I said, changing tactics. "Why them? Why those people?" For the first time, his expression faltered. He shifted in his seat, eyes darting to the floor. "It wasn't about them," he muttered. "It was about the hunt. The voices. They needed to be fed. Sam needed blood." I flicked ash from my cigarette and let the silence hang between us again. He was a puzzle, this guy. A puzzle made of jagged pieces that didn't quite fit. One minute he was calm, almost logical. The next, he was lost in some delusion about demons and commands from a dog. "You expect me to believe this?" I asked, my voice low, measured. "That all this terror, the fear you spread, the lives you took, it was because a dog told you to?" Berkowitz looked up at me, and for the briefest moment, I saw something in his eyes. Fear? Regret? I couldn't tell. But then, just as quickly, it was gone, replaced by that vacant stare again. "You wouldn't understand," he said quietly. I leaned forward, staring him down. "Try me." But he didn't. He just sat there, staring at the table, lost in whatever world he'd built for himself. We sat in silence for what felt like an eternity before I finally stood up and walked out of the room. Outside, the noise of the precinct hit me like a wave. Reporters shouting questions, detectives scrambling to close the case. The nightmare was over, or so they thought. But I knew better. Berkowitz was behind bars, sure. But the way he talked, the way he held back, it wasn't finished. He might have been the son of Sam, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story. Maybe it was the letters. Maybe it was the rumors of a larger group, of rituals and dark dealings in the shadows. Or maybe it was just the way Berkowitz smiled when he said, "You wouldn't understand." But I did understand. I understood that sometimes the monsters we catch aren't the only ones lurking in the dark. Act 4. The Unraveling Mind. We had him. David Berkowitz, the son of Sam, locked up in a cell beneath the cold concrete walls of the NYPD. The press had their story. The city could finally exhale. But for me, it wasn't that simple. The case had closed too cleanly, too neatly. Berkowitz's confessions, his eerie calm, the way he spoke about voices and commands, it was all too perfect. It gnawed at me like an itch I couldn't scratch. After the arrest, they brought me back into the interrogation room, one last time. Not to question him. No, that part was over. I just needed to look him in the eye again, to see if there was anything left to pull from the man who'd torn the city apart. He sat there, staring at the wall, like he wasn't in the room at all. They told me he had been quiet since the first confession. No more talk of dogs or demons, no more ramblings about Sam. Just silence. I pulled up a chair, sat across from him and waited. Sometimes silence is louder than words, and I wanted to see if he'd crack. But Berkowitz, he was like a ghost. His mind had slipped into something far beyond what we could touch. He didn't look at me, didn't blink, just sat there, empty. I'd seen men like him before, killers who got caught, who suddenly realized their story was over. But Berkowitz, he was different. He didn't seem defeated. If anything, he looked free. "They think it's over," I said after a long stretch of quiet. "The papers, the city. They think you're the only one." He didn't move, didn't even flinch. But I kept going. "We know about the others," I said, watching for the slightest reaction. "The group, the rituals. You didn't do this alone." His fingers twitched, just barely, but it was enough. "The letters," I continued. "You mentioned them, more than once. This wasn't just about you. So tell me, why cover for them? Why take all the blame?" For a second, just a second, his eyes shifted toward me. There was something there. Fear, maybe, or something darker. But then it was gone, replaced by that same vacant stare. "You don't get it, do you?" he finally whispered, his voice hoarse like he hadn't used it in days. "It's over. I told you everything you need to know." I leaned in closer, letting the cigarette burn between my fingers. "You're lying." He smiled, a slow, chilling smile that crawled across his face like a shadow. "You think you know the whole story, Rayne? You don't. You're just scratching the surface." That smile, it sent a chill down my spine. I had him, right in front of me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were only seeing a fraction of what had really gone on. He kept talking, almost to himself now. "The voices, they never stop, you know? Sam, he's always there. But it's not just him. There's more. There's always more." I pressed him. "Who? Who else is out there?" His eyes locked onto mine, and for the first time, I saw real fear in them. "They'll come for me. And when they do, you'll see. It's never just one." I stood up, flicking the cigarette onto the floor. I wasn't going to get any more out of him. Berkowitz wasn't lying, not exactly. But he wasn't telling the full truth either. His mind had unraveled to the point where he couldn't separate reality from delusion. Whether he was part of something bigger, or whether he'd just convinced himself that he was, that was the question that would haunt me. Outside the room, I lit another cigarette and looked out over the city. The rain had finally stopped, but the street still glistened under the dim glow of the streetlights. The nightmare was over, they said. Berkowitz was behind bars, and New York could breathe easy again. But I knew better. There were still too many unanswered questions. The letters hinted at more than just one man. They talked of rituals, of orders given by some larger force. Was it all in Berkowitz's head? Or was there something darker, something still lurking out there, waiting for its chance to strike again? I left the precinct that night with more questions than answers. Berkowitz was the killer, of that there was no doubt. But was he working alone? Was he just a puppet? Or was he pulling the strings? As I walked down the rain-slick streets, I couldn't shake the feeling that the son of Sam wasn't the end of this story. It was just the beginning. Act 5. The Shadow Lingers. The days after Berkowitz's arrest were filled with the kind of relief that only comes after a city has been pushed to the edge. The press ran their stories. The papers printed their headlines. Son of Sam caught. It was over. Or at least that's what they told themselves. New York moved on, the people slowly crawling out from under the weight of fear that had smothered them for over a year. But for me, the case never really closed. The more I dug, the more questions I found. I spent hours combing through the files, revisiting every crime scene, rereading the letters, searching for something, anything, that would give me a clearer picture of the man behind the murders. But all I found were fragments, pieces of a puzzle that didn't quite fit together. The letters were what kept me up at night. They were erratic, rambling, sure, but there was something deliberate about them. The references to rituals, to a group that worked in the shadows. The 22 Disciples of Hell, he wrote in one. A cult, perhaps, or just a figment of his twisted imagination. Then there were the reports from Yonkers, strange occurrences in the weeks and months leading up to his arrest. Fires, sacrifices, a small group of like-minded individuals gathering late at night in the woods. Were they real? Or just the fever dreams of a city desperate to explain the unexplainable? I went back to Pine Street, to Berkowitz's apartment, trying to get a feel for the place that had become his hideaway. It was a small, cramped space, cluttered with old newspapers, books, and drawings, most of them filled with images of violence and chaos. On the wall, scratched into the plaster, were symbols, pentagrams, strange markings that pointed to something darker than a man simply losing his mind. I stood in the middle of the room, cigarette burning in my hand, and I could feel it, the weight of something bigger, something just out of reach. The city might have gotten its villain, but I wasn't convinced we had the full story, and maybe we never would. The official line was simple. David Berkowitz acted alone. He was the son of Sam, a madman who heard voices and killed because of them. But the more I pieced together, the more it felt like there was something missing. Berkowitz didn't deny his role in the killings. He owned it, claimed the name of son of Sam with a twisted sense of pride. But the way he talked, the way he hinted at forces beyond himself, it kept pulling me back in. The police were satisfied with his confession. The case was closed. The city had their monster locked away for good. But I couldn't stop thinking about what he said. The last thing he whispered to me in that interrogation room. It's never just one. I wanted to believe it was over. I wanted to believe that Berkowitz was just a delusional loner, a man whose mind had snapped under the weight of his own fantasies. But I couldn't shake the feeling that the truth was more complicated than that. I started digging through old reports, unsolved murders, mysterious disappearances. It was a rabbit hole, and I knew it. But once you've stared into the mind of a killer like Berkowitz, you start to see the patterns everywhere. The stories of satanic cults, secret gatherings in the dead of night, whispers of something dark and ancient. It all began to blur together, creating a picture I didn't want to look at, but couldn't turn away from. The question haunted me. Was Berkowitz part of something bigger, or was he just a man slowly losing his grip on reality? Maybe the voices were real to him. But what if there were others? Others who heard the same calls, who followed the same path. In the end, I knew I might never get the answers I was looking for. Berkowitz was locked away, but the city still felt uneasy, as though the real danger was still out there, lurking in the shadows. Maybe it was just the remnants of fear left over from his killing spree. Or maybe it was something else, something deeper, more sinister. I left Berkowitz's apartment that night, the rain tapping lightly on the window pane, the streets of Yonkers empty and quiet. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Not really. The case was closed, the papers had their headlines, but I knew better. The shadow of Son of Sam lingered, like smoke that refuses to fade. As I walked back to my car, the streetlights flickering in the distance, I lit another cigarette and took a deep drag. I'd spent my whole life chasing monsters, and sometimes I caught them. But more often than not, they left behind something darker, something that stayed with you long after the case was over. I slid into the driver's seat, started the engine, and stared out at the empty streets. New York had its closure. But for me, the hunt never really ends. Not when you've seen the things I've seen. The shadows, the whispers, they're always there, waiting, watching. And somewhere out there, I knew there were more like him. More killers, more monsters. I wasn't sure when they'd surface, but I knew one thing. I'd be ready when they did.